So today we're going to do a short series. We're going to kick it off and we're going to be talking about boundaries. Today we're talking about boundaries with self. One of the things that I'm really excited about as we kick off this little mini series that we're going to do on Faithful Fridays is we're going to pair that actually with some of the work we do on Mindset Mondays. We're also going to be connecting that to a 14-day challenge that we're launching this coming Monday. So on I think it's Monday, June 2nd, we're launching a 14-day challenge. It's called Strength Begins with Boundaries. And in that 14-day challenge, we're going to spend the first 7 days, the first week, talking about boundaries with self, which was an expansion of what we're going to talk about today. And then the second week, we're going to learn and we're going to talk about and discover more about boundaries with others. So in today's conversation with Faithful Friday, we're going to take a look through the biblical lens of boundaries. Why do they matter? Why are they important? Why are they good for us? Why are they healthy? And this really part of why are they God honoring? So boundaries aren't just necessarily related to other people, but they're actually, again, connected to an internal part of us. Boundaries actually start from within inside of us. And that's why it's important that we kick this off with boundaries with self. Boundaries also is important for us to recognize. Boundaries is not about selfishness. And I say that because I think for so many of us, particularly people of faith, like we've been taught that setting a boundary or saying no to someone or something, or saying yes to something that we need or some desire or preference that we have, that somehow that is selfish and therefore inherently wrong. If you've learned that, if you grew up with that mindset, if that's the framework you've been looking through all of these years, like just know that boundaries is actually not about selfishness, but rather it's about stewardship. It's about stewarding what God has given us and granted to us. It's about stewarding our hearts and our minds, our actions. It's about stewarding our time, our energy, our resources, our relationships. And when we can start to recognize that boundaries are helpful for us in order for us to steward the things that I've just mentioned, it like flips the script on the whole thing. I think it's also helpful for us if we have a framework that recognizes that boundaries require us to come from a place of strength rather than weakness. In fact, that's actually why we named our 14-day challenge Strength Begins with Boundaries. Because another thing we've often learned, we've grown up with, we've been taught, is that boundaries is a sign of weakness, but it's not. Actually, it takes far more work, far more intention and courage and strength to be able to set a boundary rather than not set a boundary. So I think it's helpful before we get into maybe some of the biblical foundation of this is to be able to say, first of all, what is a boundary? In simplest terms, a boundary is something that separates one thing from another. That's it. That's a boundary. And when we think about boundaries in our emotional, relational, spiritual, mental health, we think about it in terms of differentiating or separating between what's healthy versus unhealthy, what's appropriate versus inappropriate, what's helpful versus unhelpful. Right? It's be able to set parameters and guidelines to be able to put ourselves in positions. Again, we talked about to be able to steward well, to care for ourselves, and then in turn, as people who are caring for themselves and coming from a place of health, coming from a place of overflow, being able to care for others. So let's talk about this idea of boundaries with self. So why it matters. I'm gonna start with this verse from Psalm. This is Proverbs actually. Proverbs 4:23, where it says, "Above all else," and that says, "Guard your hearts, for everything flows from it." Okay, so that verse, above all else, guard your heart, for everything flows from it. That means our ability to set boundaries with ourselves, right? Setting boundaries around our thoughts, setting boundaries around our feelings, setting boundaries around our behaviors, because without these boundaries, we're easily swayed, right, into temptation, overwhelming emotions, unhealthy habits. Like, it requires an incredible amount of strength to be able to set boundaries in order for us to guard our hearts so that everything can flow from it. In fact, but the best example of this is we see this with Jesus. Jesus set boundaries. He set boundaries with himself and for himself. Talked several times in scripture where Jesus took time to rest. That's a boundary, right? He wasn't being selfish with his time. He was actually stewarding his energy, right? This idea, if I'm going to be able to care for others and care for them well, I need to rest. So there's multiple passages that tells us and reminds us Jesus took time to rest. I think one of the things that's most notable in Jesus' life is he said no to temptation. That's really the work of boundaries. If we put it down to its simplest form, it helps us to be able to clarify, what are we going to say yes to, and then therefore inherently, what are we going to say no to. Jesus had the strength, the fortitude, right, to be able to resist and say no to temptation. And then we also are reminded in Jesus's story that he took time. He took time to pull away, to meditate, to pray, to reflect. Right? And by doing so, again, that wasn't it wasn't rude. It wasn't selfish. No, it was something that he felt strongly about, something that he needed to do for his personal relationship with his Father, right, with God. And in the same way that we talked about boundaries that Jesus set, it's important that we have that same mindset for us to be able to set boundaries with ourselves. So I want to talk about a little bit the biblical foundations for boundary work with self. I think one of the things that's foundational and kind of most important to this is the idea of self-control. Scripture talks a lot about self-control. In fact, in Galatians, it calls us to the idea of the fruits of the Spirit, right? That's self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. So setting boundaries with ourselves, as much as we try to do as people of faith, where we are just saying, hey, it can be mind over matter, and I can just gut it out and I can grind it out, is to be able to know it's actually a very spiritual experience for us to practice, deepen, strengthen self-control. So we invite like this spirit-led practice where we are able to strengthen self-control. I think there's in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, we're reminded of the principle of renewing our mind. So it says in Romans 12:2, it says, do not conform any longer to the patterns of this world, but by the renewing of your mind. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Right? We can set boundaries around what we consume, what we give time and energy and effort to, where we allow our mind and our thoughts to wander. In fact, cognitive behavioral therapy talks about this. It teaches us to challenge those unhealthy thought patterns, right? And ultimately replace them with the truths of God. One of the things I love about the integration of psychology and theology is just this recognition that although there's science, there's psychology, we have all of this language and these frameworks and these models, which are all super helpful. We have to recognize this. They're actually all founded in our biblical model. They're actually, even though some of these principles are only 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 plus years old, they actually have thousands of years of history, of wisdom, of biblical truth. So I love that we can take a Bible verse that was written thousands of years ago and then hold that up next to a framework, a model, which I just mentioned, one of them, cognitive behavioral therapy, and to be able to see the overlap, to be able to see from what is secular to the sacred, and in the midst of that, there's truth. Okay, so another one of those comes from the idea of dialectical behavioral therapy, which is this idea of taking thoughts captive. So we know this is from 2 Corinthians 10. I think it's 10 verse 15, where it says to us, take every thought captive to make it obedient to Christ. It's talked about cognitive behavioral therapy and the idea of thoughts and feelings and behaviors, challenging those unhelpful and unhealthy thoughts, replacing them with the truths of God. This idea of DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, this ability to be mindful and thoughtful, like in the midst of the thoughts that we have, holding them captive, right? To be able to manage and navigate those thoughts in a helpful and healthy way. And then I think one of the other things, and this might go back to the idea of self-control, but it's just our ability to say no to sin, right? To resist temptation. Like when we set boundaries, we're essentially, what we're doing is we're pre-deciding, right? I'm not going to allow myself to step over this boundary, which would put me in proximity of something that might be very tempting to me, right? Which would draw me closer to something that I know is not helpful and not healthy and not godly and not honoring, right? Something that is sin, right? I'm going to set a boundary to be able to ensure that I stay on the other side of that temptation, right? Man, there's such, when we can pre-decide, right, with conviction and with resolve, boundaries are so important in our lives. Let's just talk about maybe just the practical ways that we can set boundaries with ourselves. There's so many of them. I won't have time to go through every one of them, but just a few of them. So one of the common boundaries we can set is with time. Like the reality is we all have 24 hours in the day. Now I know that some people seem to be more productive than other people with those 24 hours, but the reality is we all have the same amount of time, 24 hours. Now, the days that and years that we live here on this earth varies, right, from person to person, but time is something for us to steward. And so time management is the work of a boundary. So how might this play out? So think about this. Jesus regularly withdrew to rest and to pray. It's important for us to do the same. He actually modeled that for us, right? When we can actually set aside times to take care of ourselves, whether that is rest, whether that is exercise, whether that is our spiritual disciplines, whether those are physical disciplines. It's important. Those things don't get done. They don't happen all by themselves. They happen with intention. And one of the intentions, again, is this idea of time management as a boundary. Another one that's so important in boundary work is what's called emotional regulation. So there's this reminder in Proverbs where it says, better a patient person than a warrior, one with self-control than one who takes a city. Wow, that's a big statement, right? Better a patient person than a warrior, one who has self-control rather than one who takes a city. I love this because it aligns us with this idea of strength, right? Incredible amount of strength that it takes to be patient, or the incredible amount of strength that it takes to practice self-control. And that pairs it up again, this kind of like macho and manly idea of a warrior and one who takes the city. So when we can, like with intention and with strength, like we can practice mindfulness, deep breathing, journaling, grounding techniques, and being present. It doesn't happen all by itself, right? It's something that we work on. It's something that we deepen and we strengthen. So that leads to another common boundary we can do with ourselves, which is setting healthy habits. In order for us to be able to say yes to certain things in our life, like going to church, reading our Bible, exercising regularly, eating healthy, being in deep and meaningful relationships with other people, right? And more, right? The healthy habits. In order for us to be able to have healthy habits, we need to be able to say yes to those healthy habits. It's going to require us to be able to say no to unhealthy habits. I mean, just a super simple example. I mean, think about this. If like it's in the evening, you've had dinner, dessert is been served, and there's cookies, and they're out on the counter, and you have that first cookie and it's delicious, right? And then you want to go back for another one, but you have this moment of like, well, I don't really need another one, but I'm gonna have one anyways, and so you have that second one, and you're like, man, it was super good too, just as good as the first one, and you're like, well, maybe, well, there's still more cookies left, so maybe I'll have a third one, and then maybe I'll have a fourth one, right? That lacks self-control. It doesn't just lack self-control, it lacks setting a boundary with yourself and for yourself, right? Because it's now working against the idea of, hey, what's healthy versus what's unhealthy, what's appropriate versus inappropriate, what's helpful versus unhelpful, right? For a person who's trying to manage a healthy weight, for a person who's trying to manage their carb load or their sugar intake, right? For any one of us, we can recognize like, hey, a cookie, like I'm good with that, right? Like have a cookie, but to have 3 or 4 cookies, right? What we've done is we've overstepped a boundary, or maybe more practically is for many of us, we actually never set a boundary, right? Which is a whole nother dilemma of, it's not just being able to overstep a boundary we've set, but I think for many times we've just lacked the commitment, the intention, and the follow through to set the boundary to begin with. Okay, and then one other thing that I'll share with this around the practical ways to set boundaries is to have accountability. Accountability is so important when we do the work of boundaries. One of the ways that I find accountability helpful to me is I'm a runner. So I try to run 3 to 4 days a week. One of the things that's the accountability for that is it's not every time I run, but when I can, I'll call a friend and I'll ask them to meet me at a certain location and we'll run together. So instantly in that moment, what's happening is I'm inviting somebody to hold me accountable to that run. They're holding me accountable to set my alarm, to wake up, to get dressed, to get in the car and meet them at the location at the right day, at the right time for that workout. And guess what happens? Not every time, but most of the time, right? I follow through. I show up. I do it, right? Accountability happens in our workplace. Accountability happens in our marriages, and it happens in our families. Accountability is a critical part of not just setting the boundaries, but following through with those boundaries. In fact, it's in James chapter 5, where it encourages us to confess our struggles with one another. Like boundary setting actually strengthens our connection, our community with other people. Like in counseling, we might think about the idea of like what's called peer support, right? We intentionally and strategically invite other people in to walk the road that we're walking together. Okay, so if we wrap this up, your boundaries are they're not about, I mentioned, they're not about selfishness. They're not about self condemnation. It's not about being cold or controlling. It's not about being harsh. I think that's helpful for when we can shift our mindset, and that boundaries come from a place of strength. Boundaries come from a place of stewardship. In the passages I referenced, and there are many passages I just didn't get to and could reference about the value and the importance of setting boundaries with ourselves. But I'll share one more. It's in Romans chapter 8, where it says, there is now, therefore, now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Why do I share that? It's because we know that self-compassion is such an important part of boundary work with ourselves, right? Our ability to choose to rest, our ability to choose and prioritize, right? Like our voice, our needs, our wants. That doesn't mean we have to ignore others. That doesn't mean we have to be selfish. That doesn't mean we have to push other people away, but rather it's a commitment to be able to protect what's meaningful and what matters to us. I think it's fueled by grace, right? Grace to be able to recognize we have limits, right? We all have limits. So when we can recognize that we have limits, and then extend grace to ourselves to be able to set boundaries around those limits to help us live and guide us in a healthy, in a clear, in a constructive, in a confident life. All right, it's great to be with you guys today. As I mentioned, on Mondays when we're launching this next 14-day challenge. So you can find it in the coaching platform. You can find it on the website. You can find it in the app. Click on it, join now. It opens up on Monday. And then just as no, I'll be back on Monday. We're going to do Mindful Monday, talk more about boundaries from a perspective of mindset. All right, everybody, have an incredible weekend. See you soon.